out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to You Have to Say That's Magnificent and our latest trip back into England's World Cup past. We've already been to 1982 and 1986 and talked about England's adventures in Spain and Mexico. This time we're landing in 1990. We're off to Italy, listening to the strains of Pavarotti and New Order. We're off to our island isolation on Sardinia and a transformational tournament for the England team. Joining me, making sure to hold and give, but doing it at the right time, it's Stephen Scragg. Hello.
Hello, how are we doing? I've brought my Lucozade Sport and all of that as well. And looking forward to a highly successful World Cup where I won't get injured in the last 16 and miss the rest of the tournament.
Good. And you won't be flagged offside.
No.
As with the previous two England episodes on their 1980s World Cup adventures, and also singing for England, singing the song is Joe Byatt, joining us from the land down under. Hiya, Joe.
Hello, how are you doing? And it's sparked good memories of Peter Purvis on that electric advert.
And bringing some class to proceedings, the journalist in our midst of our World Cup squad. I'm sure he'll express himself well tonight, whether it's one-on-one or not. It's Chris Lepkowski. Hello, Chris.
Express yourself, create the space, and thank you so much for creating the space. It's been a bit of a full start.
Nicely done.
I've been in and out the squad more times than an off-form Neil Webb in 1990, but I've just about made the plane by the looks of it. So thank you for having me on board.
Absolutely welcome. Well, before we delve too much into the specifics of England's campaign, just some general memories of the tournament and the time, I guess. I mean, for me, I was, what was I at this point? I was 15, nearly 16, so I was a year away from my GCSEs at this point. So I was free to watch lots of it. What I distinctly recall loads is a couple of very specific things that really come to mind. One is my PE teacher was a former goalkeeper from Scotland. I think he'd been a youth player at Celtic and didn't make the grade, and now here he was down in Northumberland trying his luck as a PE teacher. But he was obviously very big into his football. And when Scotland were playing Costa Rica, we'd had PE that day and he'd been chatting all about it. And, that didn't go so well for him. My other big memory of it, aside from the ribbing that he had to take, was that there was a kid in our year who decided to make himself a bookie for the occasion. And very much in the Peter Shilton, Gary Lineker mould that they did in the England squad over in Sardinia. But our guy, he did it in a far more simplistic way. He just literally took the fixtures and circled who he thought would win each one. And if you wanted to bet against him, you could. A draw was null and void. You just simply had to pick a winner. He lost a lot of money on the Scotland-Costa Rica one as well. Anyway, they're my memories. Joe, anything that springs to mind for you?
Being at work, the daily argument about whether it was any good or not, whether it was a good tournament or whether England were any good, and the ongoing conversations and arguments at work about it, you know. And I seem to be the only one who was enjoying it.
Well, yes, it wasn't the most stylish of tournaments in one respect, but very stylish in another, I think.
Yeah.
It's certainly iconic. Stephen, your memories?
For me, I can remember a huge amount of anticipation towards it because obviously there'd been 82, there'd been 86, really looking forward to it. I'd left school in around about the May, did the GCSEs, and had started a job in a hydraulic retail outlet. And then the tournament was kicking off on my first Friday in the job. And it was something like 4 o'clock kickoff, and I was going to miss it. I was going to miss at least the first half of it. And I quit my job to watch the World Cup. And hydraulic retail's loss has been immeasurable across all these years, I'd have to say.
And did you ever regret that choice even for a minute?
I didn't, even though it wasn't a great World Cup. It was written in the stars not to be in hydraulic retail.
Yes, their loss is.
But beyond that,
game.
it's an episode of Top of the Pops where Simon Mayo wears a different shirt, football shirt for the World Cup in every link that he does, and I've seen that in recent years as well, and it still looks massively resplendent. And there's a fair few decent tunes on that episode of Top of the Pops as well. I seem to remember.
Okay, well, your mission, Stephen, after this is to dig that one out on YouTube.
And we'll do we'll do a module on that as well.
Fantastic. Chris, were you quitting work, being at work, or pretending to be at school at the time?
I was getting home from school and about to watch Argentina, Cameroon, thinking, well, this is going to be a fairly one-sided game. I don't know much about Cameroon. I do know Argentina are the world champions, and it's going to be a fairly routine win. There's a couple of points I just wanted to pick up on there. I want to return to Joe's point later about this. Was it a good World Cup? Wasn't it? I was to get to know some journalists who are out there, and their perception of what this tournament was a world away. I suspect that what we in the UK and England were feeling at the time. And Stephen, Top of the Pops. Now, I've seen the chart that we are going to be talking about later, and I'm going to take issue with one or two of these so-called great songs that are going to be played later on. Those are my...
There are some absolute bangers in there. Without, don't get me wrong, there's some absolute dross in there as well.
Howlers.
But my God, there's some epic tunes as well.
More howlers than a Peter Shilton roll call of errors, that's for sure. I'm looking forward to this. It was a World Cup that, with hindsight, was about drama, it was about stories, it was about excitement, it was about expectation. It wasn't about the standard of football, but that's fine because you can't have it always in the World Cup.
Well, you can't deny the drama for all the lack of quality of games at times. It was a World Cup of moments, and some big moments fell England's way. So let's get into it then. England came into the 1990 qualifiers and initially off the back of what was a disastrous Euro 88. They'd lost all three group games, including to Ireland in their opener. Now that will come around again shortly. There was obviously a lot of pressure on Bobby Robson and the team following that. They'd gone to Germany with huge expectations, but had fallen rather flat when they got there. And then they found themselves in not a straightforward qualifying group at all. I mean, the first thing to note is it's a group of four, which meant only the winner was guaranteed to qualify. There were three groups of four across Europe in which only two of those runners-up would make it into the World Cup. So you had to either be top or compare yourself with the other groups. Not straightforward at all. A little room for manoeuvre, really. They were in with Sweden and Poland, who are the two stronger teams, and Albania proved to be the whipping boys that they were expected to be at that time. Some hugely iconic moments for England through this. There's Terry Butcher soaked in blood in Stockholm, a very famous image and period of the match. Obviously, it wouldn't be allowed today, but his white shirt was utterly crimson red by the end of it. That was played up as something suitably heroic and, proper English, if you like, bulldog spirit and all that stuff. It was a source of pride of how he'd carried on with blood everywhere. I think the reaction might be slightly different today. But England headed into their final qualifier, or not the final weeks of the group yet at that point, away in Poland, and England needed a point to ensure at least second place and qualification, as it would prove at that point. I recall watching this one, forever glancing at the clock in the corner of the screen, because Poland were piling the pressure on. Now, Chris, is definitely one for you, and with your Polish footballing sympathies, Poland came within the width of a crossbar of damaging England's hopes. I mean, Poland still had two other games to go after this, which, had they won them both, might have changed the picture a little bit, possibly. They were maybe a little bit too far behind. But they nearly spoiled it for England, didn't they? It was so close. And I guess that shows the sort of knife edge that European qualification was at the time. England, who, as we'll talk about, go on to reach a semi-final, whereas they came within an inch or two of not going at all.
We might be talking about merely Bobby Robson here rather than Sir Bobby Robson. Had that Poland game gone a different way, it wasn't a particularly good Poland side. It was a a team that was rebuilding after the failed 86 World Cup. They hadn't qualified for the Euros. They were nowhere near qualifying for the Euros. And they, for all the luck they had in 1976, they didn't have the same luck in 1989. Poland had opportunities to win. They hit the crossbar. Shilton made a couple of really good saves in that game. And Poland just lacked that killer instinct, really. I think a better team would have put England to the sword, knocked them out, and that would have been that. But Poland weren't a great side at the time. And yeah, England really got there on the back of some really good fortune. And, you know, credit to Sir Bobby Robson as he is now, because you know him as a manager, you've got to be more than talented, you've got to be more than gifted, you've got to be more than clever on the coaching field, you've got to be a lucky manager as well. And I think at times Bobby Robson certainly was a lucky manager, and that qualifying campaign, certainly there were a few hurdles there where had England just not quite cleared them, they would not have gone to that World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Joe, you remember this one? The pressure, obviously, Bobby Robson was under huge pressure from the press for, well, he had been throughout his reign, but I guess it's building and building towards this point. This was not the way that we look back on Bobby Robson, as Chris says, you know, the whole Sir, that probably wouldn't have happened. Well, it wouldn't have happened without reaching a World Cup semi-final. So if they'd not gone, certainly wouldn't. The pressure was immense, and they were not doing well. As we cut to the chase, they don't win the group. They end up as qualifying as the second of the three second-place teams in the groups of four. So they were literally the last European qualifier. They edged in basically by 1 point ahead of Denmark in that regard. So had they lost that game in Poland, they would have failed.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
And as you say, it's the width of a crossbar. And that width of a crossbar is the difference between everything what happened. Gazza becoming a national hero and crying, the resurgence of the game, the drama against Cameroon, everything that came ahead comes down to that width of a crossbar. And sometimes it's a fine margin between success and failure. And on such small things, the world turns.
Doesn't it just? But as ever, it's a very different squad, Stephen, from qualifying to that which ultimately gets to the World Cup with Robson. And the most notable change is, of course, Paul Gascoigne, who was not really part of the squad, at least not in regular the way he would obviously become. We look back now and see how well Gascoigne ultimately played in the 1990 World Cup, how he is the most iconic image in terms of England of that World Cup, of course. He was, he's a world star at that time, but only you go back a couple of months and he was possibly not even going to go, only securing his place in the spring, playing a decisive role in a friendly against Czechoslovakia at Wembley, I remember, scored, I think, and maybe set up another in that game. And the cameras kept zooming in on Bobby Robson on the bench, nodding approvingly. But how different, again, so we talk for Bobby Robson, things have been different, had that crossbar not being thudded in quite the same way. Well, Gascoigne very nearly wasn't part of it all, or at least less certain to be part of it all. Then we look back now and think, oh, it was obvious he was our best player by a distance.
Yeah, I think Bobby Robson tried to play cool when it came to Paul Gascoigne, because he'd been knocking around the squad. I think he did get on as a substitute in a couple of, or at least one of the qualifiers. Scored an absolute blinder against Albania at Wembley in something like a 5-minute cameo or something.
Pretty much everyone scored in that game.
Yeah, and but yeah, he was thereabouts. But yeah, he was kind of like you had this kind of this span of time from qualifying, getting that qualifier over the finishing line against Poland. They had about, it was like six friendlies, 6 warm-up games, maybe 7 if you included the Tunisia game that was just before the finals as well. There were times when he wasn't named in the squad for the main game and he was being thrown into the B internationals. So there was this kind of, well, prove that you were for placing the squad. But there was a huge groundswell for him to be in it. So I don't think, if he stank domestically in 1989-90, if he'd have injured himself, as he would do at the 91 FA Cup final or something along those lines, The only way that Paul Gascoigne probably doesn't go to that World Cup is just at his own behest, at his own sense of misadventure at some point, like he would miss out on Euro 92. But I think within that, I just couldn't see that happening to him in a world where Bobby Robson's the England manager, because I think Paul Gascoigne seemed to think so much of Bobby Robson, and Bobby Robson. Essentially, I mean, I must have seen it online yesterday, and again, I think that goal was involved in that footage, which is why it was so readily to mind. And it was an interview after that Albania game where Bobby Robson's talking about Gascoigne and how he threw him onto the pitch, and I don't know, it's either Barry Davis or John Motson posing the questions, and he's talking about it, and he said, Gazza came on and he played absolutely everywhere other than where I told him to. But his face lights up as he's saying this as well. So it's one of these type of interviews, a collection of words that Bobby Robson has uttered that if it was put into print and then put in the paper the following day, it would sound awful, and they've been able to tag a really negative headline to it. But because it was a televisual interview, it was a totally different thing, because he was just bright-eyed. You could see the excitement in Bobby Robson about this talent that he had at his disposal. So while there were the questions, and yes, I think that Czechoslovakia game was an audition to play in the starting lineup, I think, rather than being there as a kind of rabbit out the hat as a substitute. I think, I don't see a world there where he wouldn't have taken a fully fit Paul Gascoigne to the 1990 World Cup. But that ambiguity over whether he was going to be front and centre as a starting midfielder or not, that was the big question.
Fair. And I guess if we look at the squad in general, Brian Robson is obviously the Captain Marvel at the centre of it all, and we'll get on to what happened with him during it all. And Terry Butcher, I guess, the other main player. We've still got the 40, almost 41-year-old Peter Shilton as the man with the gloves. There was a change of fourth choice goalie during the tournament, David Seaman there initially, and that doesn't feel like the right era either. Queen's Park Rangers, David Seaman as part of the 1990 squad, when you think obviously so much of him as England's goalie much, much later. Dave Besant replacing him. The wild card in it, I guess, was the forward Steve Bull from second division Wolves coming into the squad, which is unusual, I suppose, as a selection for a World Cup for somebody who has never and never would, in fact, play top flight football. Is an interesting one, but he would get some of the action too. But yes, Gazza is indeed in there, and we will see how that turns out for him shortly. But Chris, coming into the tournament, before we even get to the start of it, Bobby Robson, we mentioned there the pressure earlier that he was under. His relationship with the press was obviously horrific at this time, and then it was heightened even more just in advance of the tournament, wasn't it, with the fact that, he knew his contract wasn't going to be extended by the FA, so naturally he was speaking to clubs about other jobs. He'd got himself the job secured with PSV Eindhoven for the following season. But the way this came out in the press, half-truths, or maybe inferring things from the bits of fact that they did get, and then essentially, putting the pressure on, hounding him for this, calling him a traitor, telling Bungler Bobby to PSV off, as we saw in one tabloid headline at the time. It was, I don't know, it speaks of the time, doesn't it, with the tabloid wars that were going on, the ratings, the sales that they had to compete for all the time at this point, and there'll be more of that during the tournament. But Chris, it was not an easy time for Bobby Robson, given that awkward and awful relationship with the press at that point.
No, and for the context of people listening, this was a period where the tabloid newspapers were entering the very peak, really, of a tabloid war, a circulation war. And the way newspapers would operate very much around this time was that you would have the sports journalists going off to cover the football, going off to cover the tournament. You would have certain writers assigned to England, quite a few writers assigned to England, and then other writers would be dotted around the World Cup elsewhere. But the newspapers also, because it was a fairly local World Cup, it was a fairly cheap World Cup to send people to, they also sent their news hounds as well. So you had a lot of staff going who had no interest whatsoever in the back pages of team selection, of hamstring injuries, of whether Gazza will play or not, will Robson be fit or not. They weren't interested in that. They were there for the salacious gossip. They were there for the scandal. They were there to expose the so-called story of young ladies being brought back to the team hotel, which would lead the England players to famously rip up a copy of The Sun on the training ground. And all of this, and the PSV Eindhoven story really was manna from heaven for the press, because they finally had that hook. They could go for him. They could call him a traitor. The decision had clearly gone down very badly with the Football Association. And really, in many respects, the journalists, even those who are there in their duty as football journalists, and football journalists, they want England to do well, because 99% of them are England fans. They do want England to do well, but equally they are journalists who can sniff a good story where there is one, and they could sniff a very good story here of an England manager who has effectively taken a club job, not at a superpower, not at a Barcelona, not at a Liverpool, not at a Manchester United or Real Madrid, but at PSV Eindhoven. And I know those were different times then, and certainly back then PSV perhaps carried greater weight than they do now. But it was still a big story. And I think it really captured the mood that a lot of the press were sharpening their pencils going into that. They wanted to get Sir Bobby, not just the people at the front of the newspaper, the news hounds, but the back page writers too. And by the way, before I hand over, Steve Bull, he played one game in the top flight.
Oh, did he?
He played one game in the top flight for West Bromwich Albion at QPR. He never played a top flight game on grass. It was at Loftus Road. There's my bit of trivia before I hand over to someone else. But yeah, so Bobby Robson, a beleaguered manager going into this World Cup, no doubt about that.
Well, thanks for correcting me. I did not know that. So there you go. Brilliant. It's worthwhile having West Brom on here, isn't it? Clearly. Moving on. I think I keep saying this, before we actually get to the football on Sardinia, we have to talk about the music, I think, for this one. Now, we'll talk about the charts later on. We'll get to all of that. But this was a World Cup that I think changed the face of World Cup music, if you can really describe that as a genre, both for the team, but also for TV coverage as well. On the TV side, the BBC, instead of the previous usual generic electronic themes, as nice as some of them were, like in Mexico, is a very evocative theme, but, it's just some invented pap. This time we had Luciano Pavarotti making us all feel very sophisticated with the wonderfully operatic, as an opera tune should do, Nessun Dorma. And, obviously that evokes the right location, the right place, the right style for what we think of the grandness of Italy and all of that stuff. It really sets the tournament in the right place, I think. And in the years since, just hearing that tune immediately takes me back to that summer. To my mind, the best World Cup TV theme tune there has ever been. Joe, does it take you back like it does me?
Oh, yeah. And it was, and however many times you hear it, when you get to the crescendo at the end, it's still stirring, and you still got the image of fanatical Italians in the crowd and everything, and all that came with that tournament, all the drama. And John Motson described the tournament as high on drama, low on quality. And I think that's very accurate. And with that drama comes Pavarotti's great big voice and the great big sound and everything that went with it.
It's never been the same since. ITV had a decent tune, but again, it's just not quite the same. I think it's safe to say in this one. It's the BBC, it's Pavarotti that really stirred the soul. But then, Stephen, for the team itself, so what a change, what a contrast to literally everything that's gone before here. We had a collaboration with New Order, obviously a band that had been huge for a decade or more, I suppose, by this stage. A proper band with a proper song, though it does move in the second half into a slightly more traditional sing-along by the end. But what a change this was. It's all thanks to a chat between some FA bigwig and Factory Records guru Tony Wilson that just caused this all to happen, just suggesting, well, the FA guy bemoaning how all World Cup songs are crap. And Tony Wilson says, well, why don't you just do it with a proper band? How about New Order? And there it was. The contrast to everything that had gone before, and, well, probably since, was astonishing.
It was certainly compared to, oh my God, I mean, that Euro 88 one, where they're all on Wogan and Tony Adams is doing the bad acting and doing the weight training and all that type of stuff. And then was 86, we're on top of the world or something like that. Absolute, just horrendous kind of assault on the ears. But then, it seemed pretty, it was a huge kind of chasm that had been, kind of bridged here, and suddenly it was kind of like New Order who'd sprung from kind of Joy Division, and it was kind of a weird kind of thing going. Electronic were knocking around at the time, which was a sub strand of New Order, and then there's kind of Keith Allen knocking around in the background, dicking around at Melwood behind John Barnes and stuff like that, and it was and it just. There was this movement at the tail end of the 1980s called which went by the name of the Second Summer of Love, and it was all surrounded by kind of the acid house movement and all this type of stuff, and it was very much a kind of a youth early 20s movement that was very much anti-Thatcher. It was kind of the whole Thatcher 1980s, the concept of the yuppies. All of that. This was like an antidote to all that. It was kind of look, people can be nice. Life can be nice. It doesn't have to be a load of cranks in stripy shirts, with mobile phone bricks and all this type of stuff. And Italia 90 kind of represents the end, the full stop of that. It kind of began 88, Yaz and the Plastic Population, all of that type of stuff. And then it rolled on through, and then it kind of seeped into kind of guitar music, and the Happy Mondays came along. I was never a Happy Mondays acolyte, but I get why they were big. I get why people loved them. The people that loved them really loved them, and I get that why they did. They weren't for me, but I get why they were for a lot of people. And then there's New Order doing World in Motion, and it just with the coolest footballer that was knocking around at that point in time, because John Barnes was just John Barnes.
Well, on that though, Stephen, there were only a handful of players actually bothered to turn up to this, obviously, because we knew it was all crap and couldn't be bothered. But the rap, well, it's hugely famous, of course, and thank goodness John Barnes was there. But they did try it with two of the other players first. My fellow Geordies. I mean, can you imagine, though, if this was done? Paul Gascoigne had a go. I mean, crikey, that would have been horrific. But even worse, undoubtedly even worse, was Peter Beardsley had a go at it. I mean, can you imagine?
So, well, see, John Barnes had already kind of charted with the Anfield Rap 2 years earlier, so it was kind of totally made sense, And the thing is, he can hold a tune. He can actually rap. When I went to Madrid, 2019 Champions League final, we were in huge, massive square, and he was there, and he was on stage doing what was he rapping to? He was rapping Express Yourself, I think he did, and he just had the whole crowd in the palm of his hand, and the thousands in front of thousands of people, and just incredibly, and it was just kind of it just made football feel, or the England team anyway, feel a whole lot more interesting. So you had Paul Gascoigne doing some interesting things on the pitch, then there's John Barnes being really cool with New Order. And suddenly there was a bit of, and this is where I think the population at large kind of took to this England team in a way that surprises the journalists over in Italy, because they've actually got a decent kit, and they seem quite human, and there's a few cool elements knocking around. And all right, yes, Peter Shilton's still dotting around, and Brian Robson's clearly going to get injured, and Terry Butcher will be Terry Butcher, which I'll come back to in terms of Enzo Bearzot later on, if I remember. There were some really good elements about this whole landscape of this England side, this England squad, that was difficult not to get caught up in. And the whole World in Motion aspect of that played a massive, massive role in it.
Yeah, well, it definitely needed the team to do well as well to sort of add to it, really, didn't it? But it definitely had more cool. So it isn't solely Gazza's tears at the end that kickstart the popularity of England and the English game and all of that.
And a lot of people kind of like class this, Italia 90 as being the start of kind of football's rehabilitation and it becoming cool and the Premier League and all that type of stuff. But it wasn't really. It was more of, an exclamation mark at the end of the 80s and the start of the 1990s. It was kind of the last hurrah of the second summer of love.
Well, there we go. The second summer of love, Italia 90. Let's get ourselves off to Sardinia then. Well, the first thing I guess to note is that England were placed in Sardinia. They were seeded for the tournament, I think, with the sole purpose of putting them on an island base away from the rest of the World Cup. A tactical move on FIFA's behalf, I suppose, to keep them separate. Whether they hoped England would get knocked out at that point, I have no idea. But it was a tough situation for England fans. I think that's one thing to note. Many were housed in campsites well out of Cagliari without any transport back late in the night after the matches. But equally, it was a tournament which, on the fan side of things, kickstarted a few new things as well. So we have the introduction of a supporters club as a sort of means of self-vetting of England fans, registering and so on. There was a fan embassy set up, which was something that is now commonplace. But this was the first time that happened, to give advice to people and help them with where to go to get tickets, because you could just turn up and get tickets, which might seem mad to anyone looking at what's going on over in the USA right now for tickets. So in amongst it all, you have these steps that are pushing things forward, bringing it into the modern age in some respect. But on the field, though, right, Ireland are first up in the opener. A repeat of that clash in Euro 88, which Ireland won, even though England actually played quite well. This was an occasion in 1990, though, that was not a pretty affair at all. Joe, what do you make of this one?
It was all a bit torrid, pouring rain. Even when Lineker scored after about 5 minutes, there was this feeling, have we scored too soon? Can we get another? We never really looked like scoring another. And then after about 70 minutes or whatever it was, the equaliser came when McMahon didn't control the ball. And it just seemed a pretty dull trudge. But having said that, I think the hammering after was a bit harsh, because the previous two tournaments, we'd lost the first game. At least that hadn't happened. And Ireland were a pretty tough team to play against for anyone. So at least we were relatively unscathed. But no, it wasn't great. It wasn't entertaining. And the headline in Gazza dello Sport was the day after was, "No football players wear English," which is, whatever, to be expected, I suppose.
There was no chance England were going to lose that match. I think what had happened in 1988 really scarred Bobby Robson. England actually played quite well against Ireland in 1988, and they were suckered. They were suckered by a goal that really they shouldn't have conceded. And by 1990, that pressure is really getting to Bobby Robson. And there is no way he's going to lose that first match. And of course, something that really predominates Bobby Robson's reign as England manager is that shadow of Don Howe. That shadow of Don Howe throughout his time. You almost feel that all the creative spirit that Bobby Robson brings to a managerial role, to the leading of football clubs and football teams, is dampened down by the presence of Don Howe. And I think what we saw against Ireland was a Don Howe performance. It was we must not lose this game. We'll get what we need against Egypt. We'll get what we need against Netherlands. But we must not lose this game. Because, of course, England had also lost the opener to Portugal in 1986. And it took a really remarkable turnaround in the third game against Poland just to get England over that line. People sometimes forget how close England were to being eliminated in 1986. In 1988, they were eliminated. So I think what we saw in that game against Ireland was the Don Howe impact of that team, really.
And it was always set to be a cagey group, wasn't it? So Netherlands and Egypt, the other teams. And was it the next day or later that night? Yeah, it was the next evening. They played out a 1-1 draw. This is the European champions, Netherlands, of course, who had run a merry dance around England at Euro 88 in the group stage, but they weren't quite at the same level this time. Injuries taking a toll on people like Van Basten and so on. But that also showed that Egypt had some fight in them. So this was going to be a tough group. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. Not losing the first game was critical. I think this is also, of course, we have to mention the match in which Gary Lineker shit himself on the pitch. It's there for everybody's enjoyment on YouTube. It's one way to keep your man Marco well away from you, I guess. But there we go. That was, notable occasion for that one. It was a fine equaliser from Kevin Sheedy, it should be pointed out as well. Somebody who I once met when I worked in the supermarket in my home village when he played for Newcastle. There we go. That's a total aside. Next up, Stephen, the Netherlands, the European champions, like I mentioned there. What a contrast from the drudgery that opening game with Ireland was. Joe, you're absolutely right in terms of that headline. I remember that as well. So when we come to this one, Stephen, the change in formation is obviously a huge thing here. We're now suddenly going to a sweeper system with Mark Wright coming into the team to play that role. He was at Derby County at this point. An elegant, stylish player always. Bobby Robson would claim that this was something he had always planned for this game, but it's odd that this is something that hadn't really been seen before from England. Maybe they just trialled it behind closed doors. There were always rumours, of course, of player power, strongly denied by everybody involved, I should point out. But what an incredible contrast. It seemed to free up the likes of Gascoigne, who had a fantastic time in this game. Cruyff turns against the Dutch and all of that. It's just a shame England couldn't get the win. Stuart Pearce scoring, in inverted commas, late on with an indirect free kick that flew straight in. But yeah, what a contrast.
Oh, this was very different. This was it was quite shocking that England were trying something different. I can remember one of the warm-up games where England lost to Uruguay and played quite well, and John Barnes played up front.
That game convinced me that Uruguay were the world beaters and were going to win the World Cup in my childhood. There we go.
But no, I remember that. But that in itself was shocking in seeing him push John Barnes central rather than just making him hug the touchline, the left-hand touchline. So that in itself was a bit of a shock. It had been a shock that he was kind of like willing to let Paul Gascoigne have a go at starting games. So like the Czechoslovakia game, and then so the. Now, as you were getting into this kind of like this Netherlands game was getting closer, and just how much they had destroyed England at Euro 88 as well, it goes to be said there. You did look at that and think, how is that going to pan out then? But even then, you were looking at it and thinking, 4 or 3 teams can go through here, even if England lose. If they don't get battered, then they've still got a great chance of going through. But then they went toe to toe. Changed the formation. In comes Paul Parker as well, I think, who plays kind of as a right wing back, and just a position he'd never really played because at QPR he was part of a 3-man central defensive unit where he would play as the right side of a back three. So he kept on saying, "I'm no right back, I'm no right wing back." Yeah, he absolutely nailed it every time he played. He was one of the revelations really of that World Cup. It has to be said. So yeah, this took everyone by surprise. Yeah, very, very England of them, and it will come to fruition as well of the West Germany game. England's best performances in this World Cup, they don't actually win the games that they play the best football in. But yeah, I can remember that Stuart Pearce free kick arrowing in and then it being disallowed, and it was kind of like, yeah. But no, it was. But again, you do have to look at that Netherlands side and just think, that they were in self-destruct mode at that tournament as well. Heavily into self-destruct mode, Leo Beenhakker in charge. Packed with players who could just switch on at any second. So yeah, that game against the Netherlands, it tends to go forgotten compared to the West Germany game, obviously for where it lands in the tournament. But it is a kind of a heavily unconsidered classic in a way, despite there being a lack of goals.
Yeah, well, it was certainly a huge change for England. You mentioned there Paul Parker coming in, Gary Stevens, the one who dropped out, the other change, Mark Wright coming, Beardsley was the one who dropped out. So ostensibly you've got two more defensive people coming in. I mean, one defensive person dropping out and a forward dropping out, and yet it made England far more attacking. This was a real leap of the mind for people at this point, because as much as Liverpool had played sweeper at times and all of that, and played quite progressively with it, it was still unfamiliar to English people, and in popular perception, it was obviously a defensive thing. Now, whether Bobby Robson actually thought of it as a defensive tactic to negate people like Hulk and Van Basten, I guess that's open to conjecture of whether he actually saw it as an attacking ploy, but it worked out that way.
It did work out that way. I mean, it's a good point. Does he feel that formation with defensive methods in mind? Does he stumble across that as an attacking formation by accident? We're never going to know that now. But yes, this was the. But what I would throw into that as well is that the closer Bobby Robson gets to the end of his reign, the braver he gets. And there's no reason why he shouldn't go into that Netherlands game thinking free hit. If we lose this one, we can go out and beat Egypt and through the go. So maybe he doesn't go into that Netherlands game with quite the concept of whatever we do, don't lose that he did against Ireland.
Well, the other thing notable in this game, Chris is Brian Robson disappearing off and leaving the scene yet again. Now, I think there'd also been various hijinks in the England camp where he'd managed to drop a bed on his own toe whilst trying to antagonise Gazza, having been on the lash for a decent amount of time, which is very Brian Robson and Gazza, I think it's fair to say. So, yes, he injured himself, but then I can't remember what actually happened to him this game in terms of injuries, but yes, it was enough to see him out and David Platt taking his place in this game and ultimately going forward in the tournament to very good effect, it has to be said. And England seemed, unfortunately for those who really like Brian Robson, Chris, in World Cup terms since '82, where he was, I think, England's best player, England seemed to do better without him at the World Cup.
Yeah, it's a strange one with Brian Robson because he always insists that his injury, an injury that he picked up when he was at first at West Brom, he broke his leg, I think, 3 times, and he claimed it was a result of one of those breaks that later came back to trip him up, if you like, in that Italia 90 tournament. I have also heard the stories about beds being dropped. I've also heard the story about drink being consumed. So I think the truth with Brian Robson is somewhere between the two. I think it is very clear that at 33 years old, he's clearly coming towards the end of his powers, really, in that midfield role. I always find it quite interesting that the system that England fell into, be it by design or by player power, Brian Robson, for one, always said it wasn't the players, it was Sir Bobby Robson who instigated that, and he said that some time later. But had things turned out differently and had Brian Robson stayed fit, I just wonder if he might have been that man at the back, the sweeper, who might have taken that Mark Wright role, because he had the footballing intelligence. I think he was clearly becoming more immobile by this point, although he still had a couple of years left in him. I just wonder whether he might have been that player to lead that particular position, allowing David Platt and Paul Gascoigne to flourish in the way they did. We will never know, but I think it's very clear that once again, a World Cup is defined by an injury to its captain. This happens so often with England, whether it's Brian Robson in '86, David Beckham thereafter, if not a captain, then a key player like Rooney or Owen. England always seem to lose players in these tournaments, and it always seems to be in that critical second match. And I honestly do think that had Brian stayed fit, I think that England backline might have looked slightly different with him in that role. It was something that had been spoken about when he was a player, something that had been mooted when he was a player. I just wonder if they might have tried him there.
Oh, that's an intriguing one. I'd never really thought about that. I guess, that's following the Beckenbauer mold, isn't it? Move further back as you get older and try and lead the game from there. I don't know whether his character of being the all-rampaging, all-action player would have dealt with that. I don't know. We shall never know. But yeah, intriguing one. He certainly had the quality, of course, and all of that to have done so. We shall never know, as you say. But he was gone. David Platt was in, and things would go rather swimmingly for him as we get a little further forwards. But up next, Joe, we are into drudgery once again with this group. I think it has to be said the group is poised on a knife edge at this point. So after 2 games for everybody, literally everything is equal. Everybody drew 1-1 in their opener. Everybody drew 0-0 in their second, with Ireland and Egypt doing exactly that. So everybody is 2 points with 1 goal for and 1 goal against. Therefore, meaning any drawn games in the last one will result in drawing of lots. So things were pretty dicey, I suppose, at this point. Egypt were, you'd expect England to get past them, but they were no mugs. They'd proved that already against Netherlands and Ireland. They were tough to play against. They gave England quite a few scares in this one too. I think for all we can laugh about Peter Shilton at various stages, I think this is one where he did do a fair bit to help England stay without conceding in this one. And then Mark Wright with a glancing header to win the game. But this was, again, it wasn't quite the Netherlands game, was it, Joe?
No, it was a return to 4-4-2, and again, another dull trudge. But, I suppose we deserved to win because we scored more goals. But, yeah, there wasn't much you could really cling to. But we won. We did win the group. We were the only team to beat Egypt, and that proved decisive. So you take what you can. And then, you look in the other game where Ireland and the Netherlands just played out the last 5 minutes. You think, well, hang on, we're not that bad really, are we? We're not as bad as, has been implied. We weren't setting the world alight, but we'd won the group after previous tournaments, the previous 2. That's not too bad at all. So, yeah, we just did enough to win. And I'm glad Mark Wright scored because he'd come in the team and made a huge difference. I think the free kicking was by Gazza, so that was a notch to him. So it was just a relief to get through, and that was it. At that point, that'd do because it had been a pretty stop-start competition for us up till then. So first things first, we're through, and we'll see what comes next.
Well, we would indeed. So what came next? Obviously a trip away from Sardinia now, off to the mainland. As group winners, so Ireland and the Netherlands, drawing the other one, had to draw lots, and the Netherlands ended up with the worst end of that particular draw. England, though, were group winners and off to face the runners-up of Group E, which was Belgium. Now, this isn't Belgium at their strongest, in that they'd been probably mid-decade or earlier decade, but still very strong. Enzo Schifo, a superb player. We had the tail end of Jan Keulemans by this point, Eric Gerrits and so on. But there was still a fair bit of quality in this team. But what I really remember well, because by this point, Cameroon had already got through. They'd won the first of the second round games against Colombia. So we knew what was awaiting in the quarterfinal should England get there. I distinctly remember, and I think it was Bob Wilson in the studio, but I distinctly remember the comments of talking about what an opportunity this was to reach the semi-finals. We're jumping way ahead here. So we haven't even played the round of 16 game with Belgium, and people were commenting on the easy route, the easy route of Cameroon, the easy route to the semi-finals. Very dismissive, very arrogant. Somebody in the studio did point out, well, that same opportunity is there for Belgium, which indeed it was. Such as that opportunity was, we will get on to Cameroon and all of that in due course. But I think that's something that I really vividly recall being discussed openly in advance of this Belgian game, was just get through this and the place for the semi-finals is theirs for the taking. That was, well, a lot of twists and turns before they got to that. But this game, Stephen, this was absorbing, nerve-wracking. Belgium hit the post twice. John Barnes had a good goal disallowed. So while we could, yes, point out how Belgium possibly had the better of things overall at times, England really had their chances too. But then David Platt right at the end. I mean, what an incredible way to win a game. This is goalless up until the 119th minute. We have an England free kick just into the Belgian half, I think. Gascoigne had been racing through, got felled. And then instead of a shot, which the commentators all thought he was going to do, he floats the ball in, and the rest is history, as they say. What a way to win a match when you're seconds away from your first ever penalty shootout. You don't want to have penalty shootout in a World Cup, do you?
Oh, you don't want any of that. You need games to finish in natural order, don't you? That's why Euro '88 is so good. There's no penalty shootouts, none of that. No extra time. Just all done and dusted with style and panache. But no, yeah, the England. Do you know what? I think I was looking forward to a penalty shootout for that one. Actually, in so many respects, Belgium were the better team. You can't say they weren't in that game. And yeah, Barnes had that goal disallowed wrongly, but Belgium have come so close on several occasions. And yeah, that's not a classic Belgian side. They're nowhere near as good as previous vintages. But the result, as you said, there's still plenty of talent in there. I mean, I'm looking at that and thinking, you've got Nico Klassen on the bench, and he was a bit of a washout at Tottenham. And if that's your plan B, then they'll be all right. But yeah, I think that whole concept of batting back and forth between the formations didn't always do them the best of good. And within that, they didn't necessarily do that just solely game to game as well. You can look at kind of like where they play 3-5-2. Yeah, you only have to look at the substitute to see where they go when they make those changes. It does go back to 4-4-2 partway through a lot of those games, and vice versa as well. But yeah, that Belgium game, I think it was all suddenly all the warts of it, all of the anxieties of it, just washed away in that one moment of shock and awe, which is what it was. Because this floated free kick and I can remember being amazed yet partially disappointed as well in the fact that I was delighted that Steve McMahon was getting games in this World Cup, and suddenly there's David Platt doing something like that, and you think, yeah, you're not getting your place back for the next game, Steve McMahon, unfortunately. So yeah, but what a goal! It stands the test of time massively. And there's so much that goes on around that as well. It's
the commentary too. I think we need to talk about that.
The commentary, but also the facial expression of Gary Lineker as he tumbles on top of this mad pile on at the side of the pitch. And is this the game where Bobby Robson does that little bit of a kind of like a dad jig? Yeah, exactly the type of thing that everyone's dad did after they had kind of like 3 or 4 pints at a family fancy dress party.
I don't know if you're aware, after that Belgium game, David Platt gave the greatest interview he's never done. A colleague of mine who I'd later work with, a guy called Ian Willars, went to that World Cup. And he was there to basically shadow and hang around the two West Midlands-based players. So that would be David Platt and Steve Bull. And when David Platt scored that goal, he had people phoning him at his hotel. No mobiles back then. If Platty or Bull do anything in this game, you've got to get hold of them and you must provide some copy. Of course, David Platt scores that in the 119th, whatever minute it was. And David Platt is nowhere to be seen. He's not stopped for the interview. He's buggered off. So my colleague just basically writes a piece. David Platt today declared this was the greatest game of my life. And he never said a word of that. And sometime later, my colleague, God bless him, he's no longer with us, was challenged that it was very un-David Platt-like, the comments. It didn't really sound like the kind of thing David Platt would have said. And he said, well, it's what he would have wanted to say. And he left it at that. That's just a little bit of insight into what the media are up to during that World Cup. And we've touched upon it already, how fraught and difficult that relationship was. It's really interesting that Stephen made the point earlier. There were 2 results, 2 games, Netherlands and Germany, where England played well. But it was this victory against Belgium. I remember being at home watching it with my mum and dad, and my parents had a party on that Saturday following it. So it would have been Cameroon. I remember saying to my mum and dad, I can't wait for Saturday because we've got the party and England are going to qualify for the semi-finals of the World Cup. I was that Bob Wilson at that point, or whoever it was. I thought there is absolutely no way in this world England are not going to get past Cameroon.
I think one of the significant aspects of the victory against Belgium is the entire perspective towards the England team and the tournament and the manager changed in that moment. Suddenly, there was a wave of optimism and a wave of euphoria. And it all comes from that goal, that moment. Lineker on the pylon and everything. England have done it, and the last minute of extra time was Motti's cry out. And that's when everything changed, one of the real pivotal points in the history of modern English football.
Oh, very much.
That was the real thing, because England didn't have those moments. And when it went in, I remember my mate saying he kept looking at the pitch, waiting for the referee to disallow it, waiting for a problem, waiting for some reason. This hadn't happened because England don't get these moments. You realise it has happened. We're in the quarter-final. Wow, anything can happen now.
It was a golden goal before there was such a thing, I suppose, wasn't it? There was no coming back from that. They were on the canvas. And then, it led to all the let's all have a disco type of stuff in the crowd with the arms pumping and players doing the same little hand dances together. Waddle and Butcher captured, I think, is the image that I recall there. I think Waddle was it in the Belgium shirt and Butcher in the England one, or vice versa. Either way, it was a fabulous, fabulous moment. Before we go past this one entirely, though, Stephen, your thoughts on how different John Barnes' tournament might have been. I know he may get injured later on, but had that goal been allowed, he's always a bit of a nearly man when it comes to England, certainly in tournaments. Whereas obviously in the Liverpool Red, it was utterly different. I know we can talk of the role he played and all that kind of stuff. It's obviously very, very, very different. But this was a moment where he should have had his moment, and it was denied him for no fault of his own.
Yeah, it was that fork in the road as far as John Barnes and England's concerned. If the reset image of John Barnes has been, at tournament level, those 17 minutes or so he played against Argentina in the '86 World Cup, where he made such a big difference and nearly got England out of a hole against Argentina. And then there would have been, if that goal stands and it's the one that sends England through to the quarterfinals, then his legacy is very, very different to the one that is amplified, propagated. But obviously I wanted John Barnes to do well and to prosper. But it wasn't to be in that tournament. He did everything that was asked of him. But, within, as Chris said earlier, a Don Howe style football team, there's your kind of, dot to dot to be drawn, really. And you know what? I didn't even realise he actually played in the quarter-final until I've just had a quick look at it. He plays the first half of the quarter-final against Cameroon. I thought his tournament ended with that last 16 game. So it is the one that got away for them.
There is this perception about John Barnes for England, and there's often this sort of quite disparaging about him. But Barnes explains himself that there's different things expected from a player at international level. And people say it's because the English degrade skillful players. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, before 2002, the Brazilian public were very sceptical about Rivaldo. Then they won the World Cup and he became immortal. Similar to Del Piero in 2006 for Italy. It's just that style of player is the kind of player which, more is expected from, and they stand out more. And if they don't always deliver what you expect, it's because at that level, different things are expected. And I think it's a perfectly rational observation to say that. I don't think it was a failure for England. I think he did some marvellous things. But a lot of people would say he failed and then they'll rubbish about him being lazy. You would not get to that level of playing that he did if you were lazy.
What I throw into all this as well is that there was one man who should have been at that World Cup that wasn't, that would have been the perfect player to step in for John Barnes when he got injured, and that was David Rocastle. And it was wild that he didn't go to that World Cup. I think, I came to look at it for something I was writing one time, and I think he was involved in virtually every squad Bobby Robson picked between post Euro '88 all the way up to the World Cup squad being announced, and then he was left out of it. And he was left out of it because Steve Hodge had this comeback, this redemption 1989-90 that brought him back into the picture. Because he could play in a multitude of positions across the midfield, he was selected ahead of Rocastle. Yet that didn't take into account that Rocastle could play on either flank and did play through the middle sometimes for Arsenal. And there was a mad kind of bust-up that Rocastle had prior to the tournament when Bobby Robson went to a Southampton Arsenal game at the Dell to specifically watch Rocastle in action. And George Graham didn't pick him, stuck him on the bench. And Rocastle said, I'm positive there are some people who don't want me to go to this World Cup. And maybe George Graham is one of them. And it just unravelled for him after that as far as getting to that World Cup was concerned. It was wild because he took part in 5 out of the 6 World Cup qualifiers that England played to get to the 1990 World Cup, starting 3 of them. And again, you know, he always did the job he was asked of. And he was a wonderful player. Just had that little bit of difference that could have been brought. And within that, you know, Trevor Stephen is a player that I admire massively. And he would have been the ideal juxtaposition to Trevor Stephen as an alternative option to bring from the bench as a substitute, especially in those games, because, you know, Joe spoke about John Barnes, stuff like that. But Chris Waddle was guilty of a lot of those things that John Barnes gets lambasted over for his England career. And he would often get hooked. And again, there's the ideal player to throw on for Chris Waddle when it's not as nice. And I always kind of, I couldn't quite get my head around that one with David Rocastle not being part of that squad. But certainly beyond John Barnes' injury, he would have been the ideal player to just have it. You know, for David Rocastle, he could have had the 1990 could have been his version of John Barnes in '86. That he's the man that's thrown on towards the tail end of a game that might just get you out of might get you out of a hole.
I think one of the big problems with David Rocastle, you know, he was such a good footballer, and I agree with you. I think he should have gone. The big problem he had, he was so one-footed, so one-footed. He was extremely right-footed, and that was it. And I think that was something that he carried around with him for his whole career. But when you look at that midfield, you're so right, Stephen, because you've got Steve Hodge, who never kicked a ball at Italian 90. You've got Neil Webb, who came on. I mean, Neil Webb suffered a shattering Achilles injury in the qualifiers against Sweden. He was never the same player again after that. And he came back for the final few weeks of the 1989-90 season. That kind of, I guess that sort of euphoria of him returning propelled him into the squad. And he was a creative player, so you could see it. McMahon never really fitted into the Robson team. It always felt like he was there because he was kind of a Brian Robson in waiting, if you like, a deputy for Brian Robson. And then you've got the wild card of David Platt. You know, David Platt wasn't really that kind of midfielder. He'd played in more advanced roles for Villa. He'd played up front for Cruyff. So Rocastle would have been such a great option. And you mentioned Trevor Stephen. I think he would have been the absolutely ideal foil for that kind of player, because you could have had Waddle drifting over to the left and Rocastle playing either centrally or on the right, either alongside Stephen or instead of Stephen. I think he would have been such a good player for England in that World Cup. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be.
It wasn't to be, but for England, it was to be. They were into the quarterfinal, and Cameroon lay in a wait in Naples. And what an epic this turned into. The supposed easy route. I mean, Howard Wilkinson was quoted as saying England had a bye to the semi-finals. We've talked of others, so he went on record as saying that. Well, Chris Waddle, after the game, would apparently, allegedly, tell Wilkinson some fucking bye that was. Excuse my language. But that neatly sums up what an incredible game this was, that England were, well, on the verge of elimination, having started quite brightly. It was anything but an easy route, an almighty scare for England, but a fantastic match, I guess, more to the point. David Platt, the new hero, gave England the lead with a fine header from Stuart Pearce cross from the left in the first half. But the second half, it all changed. Now, it may seem crazy now to think it, Stephen, but the sight of a 38-year-old part-time footballer from a small semi-pro league on Reunion Island warming up late in the first half and coming on at half time was something that sent terror through English hearts.
Yeah, it begged belief, but it was absolutely magnificent. I mean, Roger Miller was just kind of like, I think, the star of this World Cup. Everyone wanted to be Roger Miller, over the field, in the street or whatever. He was one of the, I would be, there weren't many kind of like, I want to be Baggios. There were a few Scalaccis and stuff like that. Well, one or two hipster Baggios here and there. Brazil had let us down, in the last 16, and Argentina were kind of like getting to the final by hook or crook, and most people were still looking at him as the pantomime villain. So Roger Miller was just such an upbeat kind of element of this World Cup.
You're dying to burst into his dance here, aren't you, Stephen?
Oh, absolutely. I'll certainly do that after the podcast. And it was this story of Cameroon was just magnificent. That day that I quit, that job in hydraulic retail and went home to watch the opening game of the World Cup. And there's Ozambique with his headed winner. There's the detachment of Claudia Caniggia's boot. They just caught the imagination from the start. And I remember them being there in '82, and that they came to even one goal and knocking Italy out the initial group stages and progressing to the knockout, not the knockout stage, but the second phase, as it was in '82. But then 1990, they were just absolutely unreal. They captured the imagination of the wider World Cup. Everything's certainly from an English perspective. I can't say UK perspective, but from an English perspective, everyone's looking at this England side that's rolling onwards by hook or crook themselves in a way. Yet there's Cameroon just doing great things, and then you've had the last 16 and this mad incident with René Higuita. And there's Roger Miller just kind of like making a hero of himself and all over again. And it was just, this wild thing. And then every game that they seemed to play from like the second group stage onwards, they'd have to cope with a raft of suspensions. They'd be kind of like, there's about four players are kind of like having to be changed for each game as they're going along. And I'm pretty sure there was a fair few suspensions going into that game for Cameroon, which kind of, I don't know, that kind of leaned into the whole concept that this will be a bit, this won't be too bad for England. This will be easy enough to get through because, Cameroon are a difficult team to play against, but they're missing kind of like three of the better players.
I think some of them were onto their second suspensions of the tournament by this point, which is quite some feat.
But it was just such a glorious thing, though. And I think that quarter final, there's something vaguely unsatisfying. Not that England progressed, but they did so by 2 Gary Lineker penalties, to kind of like get themselves out of trouble.
Well, the trouble they got into was thanks to Roger Miller largely as well, wasn't it? He came on and turned the game. He earned. Was he the one at Gazza tripped for the penalty? Possibly, but equally he set up the second goal for Emmanuel Akeke, Eugene Akeke, who'd only been on the pitch for a minute or so at this point. A magnificent second goal, cutting right through.
It was a great goal, and I think that's kind of like it was the goal of the game, really. I know Platt scores; it's like a header, a downward header, and stuff like that. And I think there's three. It's a great dramatic game, yet there's 3 vaguely unsatisfactory goals that England score. And I've nothing against them getting through to the semi-finals there, but I think if you could transplant Lineker's goal in the semi-final into that match, and just put a more stylistic equaliser to take the game into extra time, or at least an half decent winner. I can remember after that match thinking, really, two Lineker penalties in one game. I felt vaguely shortchanged on the manner of Cameroon's exit, I think.
Joe, your thoughts?
We hadn't had a penalty for 4 years, had we, before then, England? I remember being absolutely ecstatic when Cameroon beat Colombia. I thought, if we get past Belgium, we'll be all right, we'll be in the semi. But we've got to get past Belgium, completely forgetting that we had to play Cameroon. And then at half-time against Cameroon, it was 1-0, and it was all run-of-the-mill and straightforward, and all seemed quite, steady and on course. I remember Jimmy Hill in the studio saying, we should just shut up shop now and play the game out because we're through. And I remember thinking then, we're in trouble here because so arrogant and so dismissive of a very talented team and who moved well. They caught England out with movement, bringing a wider issue into the context. The fact that we were so caught out by Cameroonian movement, was that a byproduct of the European ban? Because we weren't used to players moving in different spaces, in different areas. Was that partly it? Because they really, really did us like a dinner for 25 minutes.
I'd just throw, just before I know Chris is going to jump in there, but I'd just throw in there as well that at 2-1 down, that's where England go 4-4-2. They take Butcher off and throw Trevor Stephen on. They go 4-4-2. So England kind of bludgeon the way back in. They revert to what they know. They go to factory reset.
I think Joe's point is such a good one about Heysel. I really do. But I actually think the Heysel ban kind of impacts England further down the line, certainly when Graham Taylor's manager, and that's probably a podcast for another day. I really feel that with this game, that comment that was made by Howard Wilkinson, I don't think people appreciate just how damaging that is in the build-up. When you're told by a senior member of the FA, the scout, he's an experienced manager by this point, Howard Wilkinson, this game is as good as a bye. You get through this, you'll get through it fine because these aren't up to much. Stephen has mentioned the suspensions. And this was such an unusual game for England because we're dealing with a period where not a huge amount is known about teams like Cameroon. This will sound really unusual to people listening now, young people listening now, who, you can watch any game in the world. You can watch coverage of any tournament, any competition. Back then, that wasn't accessible. And we're talking about this Roger Miller, 38-year-old journeyman striker, never really shone in club football, did okay. But why is it that we are so ill-prepared for a guy like him? Why is it that we are so ill-prepared for a team, a Cameroon team, who have, to all intents and purposes, done well? They've beaten Argentina, not particularly great Argentina. They've, let's be honest, fluked that game against Colombia because the goalkeeper's made a rick. Why is it that we are struggling still? And there is still that inherent arrogance that England always seem to carry into tournaments, even going into the way it's presented, the way it's framed, the way the commentators speak, the way the presenters speak, the way supporters and media have this expectation that England just have to turn up. It'll be fine. They'll get through, they'll play Germany. Germany will be a tough game, but they're as good as gone because they're as good as there because they're playing this African nation who shouldn't be there. No African nation has ever got to the quarterfinal. And that was such a big thing going into that match. I remember that vividly. And I remember there being such discourse about the fact that, a lot of nudging, kind of imaginary nudging between the pundits. Well, gents should get through here. But it wasn't that simple. And England was so lucky. And Joe, you brightly point out the first penalty since 1986, and England got 2 during that game. That does not happen ordinarily in quarterfinals of World Cups. They were so lucky in that respect.
Well, you talk about that arrogance there, Chris, and the general assumption and all of that. What would the reaction have been then had England not got those or not got the first of those 2 penalties late on in normal time?
I think it would have been. I think it genuinely would have been catastrophic from an optics point of view. I don't think I'll return back to the earlier point. I don't think we'd be talking about Bobby Robson in the same light. It's amazing, really, how that World Cup is framed and set against one game against Germany, which we'll come on to. But if England get knocked out to Cameroon, the whole narrative of Italia 90 is completely different, because you've got the whole issue around England, again, not getting past the quarterfinal, England, again, underperforming in a World Cup, England becoming the first country to lose to an African nation in a knockout tournament, to my knowledge, or certainly the first European nation to lose to an African country in a knockout stages of a tournament. So you've got all of these factors. It would have been a humiliation, I think, even though they were at the quarterfinal stage. It's amazing how much changes over the course of 4 days from that Saturday night to what would be that Wednesday. It was a Wednesday evening, to that Wednesday evening. How quickly the whole narrative and agenda alters during that period. And we go from utter, I'll say chaos is the wrong word, but fear, anxiety. We go from anxiety to utter delirium because we're in the semi-final of a World Cup. This is something that a whole generation of people have not experienced before.
Only the second time ever, of course, it has to be said, that England had reached a semi-final. This was unusual territory, to say the least. But yes, England were into a semi-final then, and in waiting was West Germany for a game to be played in Turin. And I think that's where the Heysel factor comes in again, because conversely, you had Italy, you had to go to Naples for their semi-final with Argentina. I remember talk at the time of maybe they should switch venues of the two games, make England stay in Naples, which is where they'd played Cameroon, to face West Germany there for safety reasons, really, rather than a load of English hooligans, thugs, turning up in Turin, where obviously there was a lot of lingering resentment and issues given what had happened 5 years earlier at Heysel. Whereas Italy would have probably loved being away from Naples when they were facing Argentina and going to Turin for that. There was a bit of sense in that, bit of merit in it, but it was never going to happen. But yes, England into a semi-final then. You've all mentioned already that this was, again, one of England's finest performances in the World Cup. I think they gave West Germany a far tougher game than anyone else did in this tournament. Ultimately, extremely unlucky, extremely unfortunate, played really, really well. You should also mention by this stage, England had played extra time twice already and would have to do so again in this game, which... Okay, you can look at it and think, well, that says a lot about the fitness and all of that of the English players, maybe used to playing at a higher tempo and all of that stuff. I don't know. Equally, maybe they were knackered by the point it got to the very end and were just running on empty. A fine game, some iconic imagery and moments. West Germany in their green kit, modelled on the Dutch of '88, of course, as well. It was an interesting one. West Germany's goal... Peter Shilton, for all his, I think we should point out, he rescued England again against Cameroon with some fine saves at stages when they were just literally slicing through England's defence. But my God, his boots are made of lead, just as they were in 1986, when Maradona leapt above him with a slight fist assistance. Here, the free kick deflected off Paul Parker, close it down, and it loops way up. And all Shilton had to do, he was only a yard or so off his line. He wasn't far off, as Stephen, you pointed out many, many times. He doesn't like to veer too far from his goal line, does he? He was not very far from his goal line. He had the time to cover this. He took a hesitation, a momentary pause, a little hesitation, a stumble backwards, and then kind of fell into the net with his arm outstretched. Had he just merely leapt, 5 centimetres off the ground, or not stumbled in the way he did, the ball, it fitted between his fingertips and the crossbar, basically, didn't it? And there was not much room for anything else. He's got to save that, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Think about, we have a pop at Peter Shilton on a regular basis, but I will turn around and say he's one of the best shot stoppers, 6-yard box shot stoppers.
Which in the Cameroon game was in his element.
Was, and that was it. Those saves against Cameroon were right up his street. Yet there's a goal, just as in '86, that is out of his comfort zone. There's a situation that is utterly out of his comfort zone. So this ball spoons up, off Paul Parker. He has to backpedal. He's not one for getting off the ground. I know the son of a former Liverpool coach, whose name might be Ronnie Moran or might not be Ronnie Moran, used to say the different when he was often questioned about the differences between Clements and Shilton, and he said you couldn't put a cigarette paper under Shilton's foot, in a football match, because he just did not get off the ground, and this is the example of that, one of the prime examples of that. And this is like a Peter Shilton who's nearly 41 as well. Behind him, what has he got? Without him himself having done the retirement at his own behest. And you turn around and say, he didn't didn't concede a goal in qualifying, and there's a lot of reasons why he should still be the England number one at that point in time, but there's a lot of reasons why he shouldn't.
Just on the age thing, Stephen. Yes, he was nearly 41, and for a footballer, that's ancient.
But in goalkeeping
if you think back to
wasn't.
When you were 41, I'm sure you could lift yourself
5
centimetres off the ground.
You look at a Dino Zoff at that type of age winning the World Cup, but you look at the physicality and the movement of Dino Zoff compared to Peter Shilton. Two entirely different things. And it was almost as if you look at Peter Shilton of the 1990 World Cup, and it's almost like he looked smaller than he did tournament on tournament, in the same way that your grandma shrinks. There's Peter Shilton shrinking. Grandma Peter is shrinking tournament upon tournament for our very eyes, and this is kind of part of his downfall in conceding this particular goal, and obviously, good God, that penalty shootout.
Well, before we get to that, let's deal with the fine moment. Joe, coming to you. Lineker saves England just as he had against Cameroon, but this was an altogether more pleasing aesthetic goal. A superb finish, I think, through the legs of the stretching Jurgen Kohler into the far corner of the net. I mean, it was a magnificent finish, and wow, what a delightful moment this was for England.
Yeah, it was a great moment, that was. Well, I mean, I thought we were finished. I thought there's no way we're going to come back against the best team in the tournament. So, and it was a real surprise as well, because just didn't expect us to equalise. And Lineker saved the day again. That was true character. I mean, the penalties against Cameroon and this, when it really mattered, Lineker stepped up and led. And it was just fantastic. It was just a brilliant moment. And we started to believe again. And perhaps that's one of the negative aspects of it, because it was fruitless in the end. But just enjoy those moments, because it was really special.
Yeah, it was. And there were a number of other iconic moments in this game. Chris, I think Waddle nearly scoring from halfway, although I think the whistle had gone, sadly. Waddle again hitting the post in extra time, and Lineker almost reaching the rebound. Again, whether that would have counted, I don't know. Germany hit the post in extra time as well. And we have the Gascoigne incident, Chris, in terms of his booking and suspension from the final. Okay, the German player made the most of it, but that's what happens, isn't it? It was a bit of a needless... He was late for the ball, a bit overeager. And a shame. But provided us a great iconic moment.
It's one of the most rancid rules in football, that you can pick up a yellow card and then you can pick up a yellow card in the semi-final and miss what would be a final. It's just absolutely ridiculous. I remember in 1982, Boniek, who, obviously with my Polish background, missing a semi-final against Italy for similar reasons. It's just...
Ballack missed the 2002 final.
Yeah. We see it all the time. You shouldn't be denying footballers a great chance to perform on the stage. I think what's really interesting going into this match, we see what happens with Gazza. He becomes a national treasure. He goes from, zero to hero. You could argue he then returns back to zero over the next few years. But what is really interesting here is the whole shift of the country, the whole nation suddenly are piling on. They are really piling on to England here to do well. We've got the real feel-good here in the UK, well, in England, not the UK, but the whole of England has really galvanised in a way they haven't for so many years, because Spain, in 82, England regressed with each game. In 1986, the games were played at a very awkward time of day. So this is the first real tournament. 88, of course, England bombed. So this is the first real tournament where England are really looking like they might produce something, having beaten Cameroon. And I wanted to take you back to something I said at the start, challenging the whole discrepancy between what the nation were feeling and what the media were feeling out in Italy. And I spoke to colleagues who I would later work with, and I would end up working as a journalist from around 2000 with quite a few people who worked at Italia 90, actually in Italy. And they were shocked when they returned at the euphoria, because they were being told by editors. Now, this was coming from editors. You've got to start making your copy more upbeat because at the moment you're too negative. And this was a complete contrast to what they'd been told a month before, 3 weeks before. Go for Robson. His time has come. He's a traitor. Get rid of him. Shoot him down. All of a sudden, England have beaten Cameroon, and journalists are making calls, getting calls from their news desks, their sports desks, being told, your copy is too negative. You've got to really buy into what the country's... Well, we're in Italy. What is the country doing? They had no idea. They had no idea what was going on back home. So all of a sudden, these journalists who have been cocooned on planet Italia 90, locked away from everyone, barely on speaking terms with an England team that resent them and a manager who's pissed off with them, they're having to completely rearrange and pivot towards a more optimistic, more encouraging level of coverage. And I think this Germany game is so important in a cultural sense. It really is. If you think of Italia 90, as I do, I think of England versus West Germany is Italia 90 to me, because everything else doesn't matter. This is the game that matters. And England's, it's been called as the de facto final by so many people. This should have been the final in many respects, because they were the two best teams. Italy hadn't really nailed it, and Argentina were kind of going from penalty shootout to penalty shootout. And this feels like such a turning point in the way English football is perceived, this one game. And Gazza, you mentioned Gazza in the question, getting that booking completely creates this hero, this national treasure that English football hasn't had possibly ever, but certainly not for a long time.
Joe, your thoughts on that?
I've got a long history with Gazza. I was at Anfield and watched one of his early games for Spurs. And it was absolutely brilliant. A real star. And when the cop gave him shit, he laughed and waved, and the cop applauded him for it. And it was just, he's just a star in the making. And the incident in extra time in the semi-final puts him forward as being, as well as one of the most talented players I've ever seen, and the most gifted, one of the most infuriating. Because, why did he go knowing he was on a yellow card? I agree with you about the rule, Chris. It's just, but players being suspended from finals, it's just, it needs to be addressed. But that's the rule, though. And he went for that lunging tackle, knowing he was on a yellow, and he'd lost the ball because he beat a man too many times, and he had a chance to move the ball on. So, yeah, and that's part of the lack of control which he had, and that's so infuriating. But it was devastating to see our hero blorting like he was. But, and it also led to the brilliant Lineker moment. Have a word with him, which was all part of the same story. Oh, if he hadn't gone for that lunge, if he hadn't done the lunge, who knows how it could have ended up. I mean, I think he would have scored a penalty.
Well, that's it. He would have taken a penalty.
Yeah.
He was the person that Chris Waddle had to replace. Now, Chris Waddle did not want to take a penalty.
Yeah.
And yet he had to. So, yes, let's get to the penalties. Peter Shilton decided to just watch where each one went and try to reach them. He discussed this with Gary Lineker, apparently, the night before. That was the plan. They come up with no anticipation, no reading the taker's body position and approach. It seems very naive now, but then so too, I guess, does the lack of practice on behalf of the penalty takers. Lineker, Beardsley and Platt all scored theirs before Stuart Pearce missed his. Now, normally he's a very reliable penalty taker, of course, with Nottingham Forest, a fine striker of a ball, but his shot was straight down the middle and hit Ilvener's trailing leg. He too cried. Let's point out, hard man Stuart Pearce cried, but we don't focus so much on that. Gascoigne was meant to be, who knows what order, he may not have been the fifth taker, but he would have been one of the five. But yes, Chris Waddle instead, and we all know what happened there. I think for Waddle, it's a bit of a shame. We talked about him in relation to Barnes in terms of, he's sometimes flat to deceive. This was Waddle at a time when he was running rings around people for Marseille. He was a fine, fine player. I think he played really quite well. He was freed up a bit by the system, of course. when the sweeper bit came in. I think he played very well in this, and we talked about how close he came on a number of occasions to scoring. My question, though, Stephen, to you is, would he have scored had he not chopped off his mullet in advance of this game?
There's a good question. Now, did his strength all go? Oh, what type of hair was he was he wearing for the 1991 European Cup final? So many, offshoots and a myriad of questions there. If that 1993 FA Cup final goes to the penalty shootout, who knows? It may, in just that one swoop, if he keeps that one on the crossbar in 1990, who's stepping up number 5 for West Germany? Does he score? I don't know. Does Mark Wright make a hero of himself? Who's the Gareth Southgate of the scene? If it goes further, so many unanswered questions. But they could have taken penalties all night. Peter Shilton's never going to save one. Just as I'd said earlier in the I think in the 1982 version, that
all they had to do was aim for the corners. It was a guarantee.
The corners just don't shoot down the middle. You've actually got it nailed. It's a bit like the Batterston question from the 82 module we did. Peter Shilton is never going to be high enough up the pitch to do what Tony Schumacher did to Patrick Batterston in 82, and that is why England would not be getting to a 1982 World Cup final. It's all maybe Shilton should have taken a penalty kick and Chris Waddle should have tried to save them.
Well, yeah. Maybe so. Or if it had gone to sudden death, maybe Gazza would have had to walk up with tears rolling down.
What I would throw into all that is that much kind of like thrown out, error in that. Or why didn't they put Dave Besant on as a substitute? He wasn't on the bench. This is an era in which it's the last tournament, certainly that a European nation takes part in at senior level, where you have to name 5 substitutes. And it's not just a case that the rest of your squad is available to go on as a substitute, which was always a better way of doing it. You could read between the lines in 5 substitutes being named, because it would often give you an idea of who might be carrying an injury, because you've covered that base there. He must be a bit suspect. There was something interesting in trying to work out where your frailties were on the basis of your 5 substitutes. So yeah, but within that, what I would throw in is that in that semi-final, Bobby Robson only threw on one of the 2 substitutes that he could have done. There's Steve Bull on the bench. The whole Steve Bull thing. And again, it kind of lays into the whole David Rocastle thing there as well. As that knockout tournament goes on, you look at the lack of coherent options on the bench to give England something different. I'll always say, Trevor Stevens is a great player and he can make a massive difference within the collective. But if you wanted a player to go on there and just do a piece of magic that's going to create something, then there's no one there on those England benches. And it's intriguing that Steve Bull keeps his place on the bench, yet he doesn't take any part in the quarterfinals, in the semi-finals. I think he's thrown on the Belgium game. And I think he plays about 45 minutes of that all in all, given the extra time. And I think because he's so ineffectual, I loved the Steve Bull story, the whole Roy of the Rovers element to it, and all of that, and this 3rd division football that had come good, and all of that. I thought that was great. But when you look at it in the cold light of day, I think it becomes increasingly evident to Bobby Robson as he goes along that Bull's not the man for a World Cup, and he's not going to be that player that's going to be able to do that piece of magic, basically. But for a penalty shootout, you'd surely throw him on, in the 119th minute, maybe Hooker Paul Parker, or a Mark Wright, or whatever.
Or a Chris Waddle.
or a Chris Waddle.
Can I just say, there wasn't really a culture back then for those kind of substitutions. I mean, you rightly point out this Dave Besant myth that he should have been brought on. He wasn't even on the bench. But the other myth, of course, is that if you actually look at the records of the 3 goalkeepers, all 3 of them were really bad at penalties. Besant saved one in 1988. He didn't save many more after that, if at all. I'm not sure he saved many. Chris Woods...
He didn't say much of anything at Newcastle, Chris.
Yeah, he had Chris Woods had a dreadful record with penalties, and he was second choice. There was no prospect at all that any manager would have changed the goalkeeper back then for a penalty shooter. Shilton as bad as he was, and I'm not a Shilton fan, you guys know that, as bad as Shilton was at that age, at 41, he actually had the best record when it came to penalties of those three goalkeepers. David Seaman maybe would have made a difference, but he was injured, so we'll never know.
Joe?
One thing about the penalty shootout, what strikes me, is that there's certain head in the sand approach England had, where just dismissed it as a lottery. So, well, it was a penalty. We lost on penalties. It doesn't matter. We lost on penalties. It was an honourable victory, and it was unlucky. And then, turns out they didn't even practice them. And I remember a long time after, Alan Shearer, while he was the England captain, said practice doesn't help. Now, admittedly, you can't replicate the pressure, but the idea that practice doesn't help, it's just a bit silly, isn't it? And it was just really dismissive of the skill of taking a penalty, and the cold hard truth being that the chances are to get on in a tournament, you are going to have to face a penalty shootout. Whether you like it or not, if you think the rules should be changed, that's one thing. But while it's in there, that's what you have to adapt to. And just saying that, just shrugging it off as if, it doesn't matter, it's only luck. Well, look how lucky the Germans were so constantly,
It's so naive, it really is. And it was the prevailing attitude for many years after this as well, as we well know. But England were out. They did have the small consolation of the third, fourth place playoff, which they lost 2-1 to Italy, who had their own nightmare semi-final. I would slightly disagree with Chris in how Italy were throughout, but they were fragile. So yes, you may be right overall. They're soft underbelly. But yeah, they too were out, but they beat England with another dubious penalty. Peter Shilton slightly harshly ruled against on that one. Quite why he was playing that game rather than Chris Woods, I do not know, but I guess he wanted to get that 125th cap or whatever it was by this point. And there he was. But yes, England were out. They did get a medal for fourth place, which you don't get these days. So that's an interesting little side point, which was a nice thing, I guess, for England. But they flew back to Luton Airport to big acclaim with Gazza wearing fake plastic tits, as you could imagine. The aftermath for the team beyond that legacy, obviously for Bobby Robson, his legacy was now secure. We've talked about how it might not have been so at various points through this tournament, had things gone a little differently, all the past issues seemingly forgotten, but now he's looked back on as a success, as an inspiration for those who follow, whereas in truth, he'd been hounded for so long, up to and indeed during this tournament up until it went well. On the playing front, obviously Gascoigne, a huge success, iconic. David Platt likewise for coming through, but equally I guess Des Walker had a fine tournament, would earn a move to Italy soon after. Lineker, of course, ever reliable with the stars, but Gascoigne, of course, Gazza mania soon took off after this. He's described his tears as being, I guess at the end of the game rather than those during the game, as being sadness that the best time of his life was over. And who could then think at that time that he would never play in a World Cup again? And actually it was David Platt who would go on to become the cornerstone of England for the next 3 or 4 years rather than Gascoigne. That's an interesting one to think of how fortunes change, but that's how it was. In terms of the England team in general, Graham Taylor was obviously lined up to follow. I think he was alongside Elton Wellesby with ITV for the semi-final. I think I recall, certainly for some other tournament he was. And it was well known he was going to be the next manager. But Chris, to follow this, as much as it's good to have a successful team, it's a hard act to follow, I suppose. No, we can quibble about how he went about it. That's a whole other issue. But it makes him very hard for him to take over from this, doesn't it?
It does, because Shilton, as we know, 41. Butcher's coming towards the end of his career. Brian Robson's 33. Gary Lineker's 30, pretty much. That's your entire spine, So you've got 4 key players there who are probably going to be winding down their careers. Indeed, 2 of them retire. Brian Robson ends up getting not picked. And Gary Lineker, we see what happens with his England career. I found it really... When I look back on this period, Robson's resignation kind of falls at a really awkward moment in terms of successors, because you look at who might be around. Well, Terry Venables has come back from Barcelona. He's at Tottenham. He doesn't really fit that image that the FA want, and we subsequently see what happens when he's manager and how that goes. Howard Kendall, a fantastic manager in the mid-80s, but by the late 80s, there are things catching up with him. You know, I don't think it's a secret in football that he was having problems away from the fields that would catch up with him later in life. Ron Atkinson has fallen off that perch. He's been at Atletico Madrid. Now he's back at Sheffield Wednesday. He's having to rebuild their team. He's not in the right place to be taken over. Brian Clough is never going to get the England job. So you're really knocking all of the obvious England candidates out of the equation there. Howard Wilkinson is still in Division 2 with Leeds, as far as I can recall. So Graham Taylor is kind of the obvious manager. He's taken Aston Villa to second in the league. He's led some of the England B teams. He wears a suit well. He's a statesman. He's very much adheres to the Charles Hughes philosophy of football, which of course is important, given that the individual is still within the FA, on the FA board. So he is an obvious replacement. Is he a good replacement? I don't think he is. I think there's a whole podcast that we could certainly that we should certainly do on Graham Taylor around all the things that he does badly and on all the things that hamstring him during his period as manager. But you know, it's a glorious failure for Bobby Robson. It really is. You know, from what was a lack of expectation going into the World Cup to glorious heroes. You know, and we can maybe speculate, would England have beaten Argentina had they got to the final? Maybe. It wasn't a great Argentina team, but then Gazza wasn't there. So who replaces Gazza in that team? Where maybe David Rocastle might have played a part had Stevens' squad pick come to fruition. It's all of these sliding doors moments really follow, and it feels like a huge dip in so many ways after Robson leaves with Taylor in charge, and it doesn't really recover until Venables takes charge. And I don't think it ever gets as good under Venables because of all of the advantages of playing at Wembley and playing the home game, being the host nation at Euro 96. I think what Robson achieved there is worthy of being lauded because it was tournament management. And this is something that so many England managers haven't got right over the years. They don't manage tournaments very well. And all of a sudden we had a manager who his side produced two good performances, really. A decent one against Belgium and two really poor ones against Ireland, against Egypt, and an okay one against Cameroon. And actually, when we look back on it, over those 7 games, because they obviously lost in the third place playoff, it was a good performance. It was a good outcome. And that's tournament management. And Bobby Robson succeeded finally in that respect.
Apparently, Robson wanted to carry on. But before the tournament, which is why he went to PSV Eindhoven, and it was announced before, he was told that they weren't going to keep him on whatever happened. So, and one thing is, 8 years of experience, and Robson acknowledged himself that it took him 2 years to get used to the job and the scale of what's involved. And so that 8 years of experience was all lost, and you had to sort of start all over again. And that's, you know, that was a loss. They could have had him there in some advisory role, something. It just seemed like very dismissive of, you know, a team which had finally made clear progress by hook and by crook, and it was a long, hard haul, and it was as if it meant nothing. Then we got to Graham Taylor, who had his own ideas, and we'll do a podcast about that one day, eh?
Well, that's a whole story in itself, isn't it, indeed? But Bobby Robson was off to tour Europe as the elder statesman of football, and he went to some rather grand, iconic clubs and did very well for himself and pitched back somewhere close to me at the end as well. That's fantastic for him. But yes, in terms of English football in general, Stephen, it's a bit of a rebirth. And we mentioned it at the beginning, but it's a bit of a rebirth of a love of the game. We've talked many times of the 80s, of the doldrums it was in. Chris, you've written a whole book about it, the slum sport in the mid-'80s and so on, but we're only a few years on from that now. But we've got a real love for England and English football that's suddenly come off the back of this. The song and all of that builds into it, but it all would have failed and fallen flat without the team doing well. Gazza cried and the nation cried along with him, and I think that sort of connection, I suppose, helped in some regard and newfound optimism. But I guess it's more the Taylor report ultimately is what had a more direct influence over what was to come for English football and domestically anyway. But would those changes and the riches that followed have been as possible as quickly without the story of England at 1990 World Cup?
They'd have got there, but in a slower time scale, I think. English football, whether or not it became fashionable is debatable at that point in time, but it became a little cuddlier, I think. People were looking at it slightly differently. Italia 90 passing off without any huge riots as far as the travelling England supporters was concerned was the clincher in UEFA ending the ban on English clubs in Europe. And so obviously for 1990-91, English clubs come back. It was small scale. Obviously to start with, Man United win the Cup Winners' Cup, and there's stepping stones are at play. So yeah, I think Italia 90 kind of, it does facilitate it happening quicker. There's certainly no doubt about that. I mean, going back to Bobby Robson, I think the whole kind of domino effect in him resigning before the tournament or saying I'll be leaving and I'll be taking the PSV job. I've heard, I can't remember, someone spoke to or who was surrounding it all. I think that happened like a domino effect on some comments that Bert Millerchip made that the FA themselves distanced themselves from and said that's Bert Millerchip saying that, that's not the FA saying that. And as the story goes, the FA were amenable to Robson staying on as a collective, but they just wanted to get through the World Cup first. And that wouldn't have been a completely unacceptable thing, really, because, out in the quarterfinals of the 86 World Cup, didn't qualify for 84, face plant at Euro 88. Let's see how you do at the 1990 World Cup, and then we'll move on from there. It wasn't really an outrageous thing after 8 years, but within that forward planning was remiss. They should have been looking at that landscape and thinking, well, if they weren't going to get a Terry Venables or a Howard Kendall who'd actually won stuff at that point in time. You're looking at Terry Venables as being someone who'd taken a team to a European Cup final. Howard Kendall's won a couple of First Division titles. There's more obvious candidates there. Then it would have made sense for Bobby Robson to have kept the job for another 4 years, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, we'll go into it when we come to a Graham Taylor module. But it's interesting. I mean, I'll not go into it now, but it's interesting to see the types of names that Bobby Robson was allowing into his B squad in the build-up to the 1990 World Cup. There's a few names in there that are synonymous with the Graham Taylor era. That it's interesting to see that they were on Bobby Robson's radar as well. So there is that fascinating sliding doors aspect to just, yes, what happened under Graham Taylor moving forward, but also, how a Bobby Robson England 1990 to 1994 might have shaped itself as well.
Well, we will never know. That's in one of those alternate universes, I guess, isn't it? One final thing before we delve into our usual end of pod musical interludes. This is a tournament, I think, that spawned some incredible books as well and probably helped launch a whole new world of football writing in book form anyway. I think there was the superb Football Against the Enemy by Simon Cooper as a book I loved at the time. It captivated me when I first read that in the aftermath of this. But even more well-known, I guess, is the book that my journalist in the midst comment of the intro was referring to, Chris. It's the fantastic book by Pete Davies, All Played Out, or what has become known as One Night in Turin more recently. This book caused a bit of controversy at the time, both for some in the squad, but perhaps more so for the journalists, the hacks or the rotters, as described for some of the tabloids who were part of the England World Cup circus or following around the fans, trying to provoke trouble and so on. Many of them weren't portrayed in the best of light, shall we say, and resented, I guess, not just the access that Davies was given, but the way he, as they saw it, stitched them up. So I'm kind of wonder, Chris, as the journalist with us, what you make of that, those things around that book. I mean, the book itself, I think, is superb. Anyone should give it a read, absolutely. Give some incredible insight around not just England, but various aspects of the 1990 World Cup. But it was one that gave a lot of controversial moments for journalists in particular.
It did. As you rightly say, it's a book by Pete Davis. It's actually been renamed as One Night in Turin. And of course, the book itself, all played out, did inspire the documentary One Night in Turin. So that book has been re-released. It's a very good book. And what I will say is that it went down very poorly, very badly with the football writers of the time. It kind of lifted a lid on their little industry, if you like, their sector that they didn't want to be particularly known to the public, how they operate, how they go around their jobs. You know, I've said from the start that there's a big distinction between news journalists and sports journalists. But even sports journalists have to do certain things and had to do certain things back then to get exclusive stories, to get the team news, to get all of those things that put their newspaper ahead of a rival newspaper. And Pete Davis really threw a grenade under all of that and exposed that and showed the world what that industry is like. And I enjoyed the book. I read the book before I went into the job itself, before I went into the industry. But like I say, I had colleagues and people I know who were around then, who were at Italia 90, who do frown upon some of the revelations in that book.
But for the rest of us, it's a superb book, so I heartily recommend it.
Yeah.
And it is, even the sides of it that he reveals, the inner workings of all of that is really interesting to read as well, as much as it irritated those who were part of it. Anyway, let's get ourselves to our final thing. We've been at this longer than an England-West Germany match. So let's move on to our stoppage time moments. We've got the charts from the semi-final, 4th of July, 1990. We were chatting off air before. There's some interesting, some decent stuff and some crap in there as well. There's a couple that leaped to mind for me just from some of the titles and lyrics. It Must Have Been Love, But It's Over Now. I think that's one for the Gazza would have appreciated in the aftermath of the semi-final. I think MC Hammer's You Can't Touch This is in there. That's one for Peter Shilton, I think, when it comes to an Andy Bramer free kick looping over him, or maybe it's about Waddle and his penalty taking, and no one can touch it. What do you make of it, Stephen? Were England doing the do just like Betty Boone?
Oh, definitely. Well, no, not really. When push comes to shove, as we said, they played decent in 2 games and didn't really even. That's not doing the do, is it? But yeah, I've got a bit of time for Betty Boo at number 13. Doing the do, she some decent pop songs there. But yeah, in more, I don't know, you World in Motion's at number 6 in that particular week. We've mentioned that earlier on. But yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of like unashamed kind of guilty pleasure pop songs, Wilson Phillips at number 8.
I never had you down for that, Steve.
Absolutely, an absolute banger that is. But no, in more kind of like reverential terms. I just can't look beyond the Charlatans. Number 19, the only one I know. And absolutely, I said earlier on that I wasn't a huge Happy Mondays acolyte, but very much in the corner of the Charlatans, who've just like maintained such a consistent stream of brilliant music for nearly 4 decades now. You get some bands that just they'll put new tunes out there and think, why did you bother? And I never get that with the Charlatans. Go watch them live. Try and watch them live on a yearly basis, and just a joy to watch and watch. But killer Adamski, number 20.
Yeah, that's the one.
She Comes in the Fall in Spiral Carpets, number 30. Is one for me. Come Home, James, which you can aim that at Scotland maybe after the group stages. Maybe a little bit of. I'd throw.
Correct all your comments at Stephen.
And that comes from someone who's got time, so a lot of time for Scotland as well. Number 35, Carry the Blame, California Dreaming, River City People, who are I'm mad one. The lead singer was called she's called Siobhan Mayer, and she was a children's BBC presenter on Saturday morning TV. Yet she was a lead singer in a band, during the week and stuff like that. And she ended up kind of like doing a duo called, I think they're called Kindred Spirit or something like that. And it was like one of the Bangles, which was nuts. And she was one of these kind of like, she bubbled under the surface, but was involved with some decent songs. It's My Life, Talk, number 37, although it's in brackets 1990, which goes
this
against.
It's an interesting one, Stephen, because I know it's from much earlier in the decade, isn't it? But it's a song that has always linked itself in my mind to 1990 because I heard it so much on the radio around this time. I was, as I say, 15 at this point, whereas when it was actually out, I was probably too young to fully appreciate that that's when it belonged. So that's one that always, just hearing it, makes me think of 1990.
Think of 1990. But absolutely, love that song. And Message in the Box, World Party had a fair old few decent tunes. And there was another one, way down at 95, a bit of Saint Etienne, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, which is, another one for you England fans in your penalty shootouts.
Wow, yeah, nice link. But Joe, we talked before we even started about Adamski's Killer being so linked to the World Cup. Is that right for you?
Yeah, throughout the campaign, the BBC used it for goal montages and things, and it was number one just before the tournament, and by this point, it's on the way down. But it was just really prominent on the radio all the time, and that's one of the real sounds of summer 1990, Northern Hemisphere summer 1990 anyway. I'm also drawn to Bruce Dickinson's cover of All the Young Dudes, which is a homage to Bowie, I would suppose. And the Great Song of Indifference by Bob Geldof used to get loads and loads of stick from everybody, and the critics hammering it. But, it was just a bit of a jig, wasn't it? No harm in it.
Good stuff. Chris, how about you? What was the young Mr. Lepkowski dancing around the room to?
Well, Stephen mentioned pretty much every song I was going to mention.
Well, you mentioned most of the songs in the chart.
You know what? I did say earlier on I'd need a C90 for this one, because as I was looking down that list, I was thinking, what a tune that is. What a tune that is. And but don't get me wrong, they're offset by some serious crap as well. But that's one of the most impressive top 40s that we've done in one of these modules before.
Well, I'm definitely on board with the Charlatans and In Spiral Carpets. The Adamski song, Killer, I never quite remember who sang. Was it Seal or was it Adamski? Yeah. I never quite know what's going on with that song. It seems to be, it's kind of a bit of a hybrid, isn't it? A sort of like.
I think Adamski's pushing the buttons and Seal
sort of one of these Red Bull hybrid teams that nobody really has ownership of. I noticed we've got Nessun Dorma at number 2, Mona by Craig McLaughlin at number 4, which is an absolutely horrific. I mean, you're getting into the top 10 territory. You don't want to be recording anything from here. Well, oh dear. Yeah, the only one I know is probably the first song in that top 20 that I would be pressing play and record for. There isn't a huge amount here. It's My Life. Actually, I'm completely on board with what you said, Aidan, that I thought this was a song from 1990 for a long, long time. Bearing in mind that I'm only 14 in 1990, so it wasn't until I kind of started to explore music a lot more. And
just sorry to interrupt there, Chris, but I'd throw Whole of the Moon into that kind of quadrant as well. I mean, we did there was a module I did with someone not so long ago where I was shocked. It was in like a 1985 chart or something like 85 or 86.
Not 91.
I was totally stunned that, so I was exactly the same in that respect, is that, I was thinking how I relate to it being that early 90s tune.
So, It's My Life, which is a brilliant song. Talk were brilliant. But at 14 years old, they're not really on my radar for exploring in any great detail. It's not until the internet and YouTube and search engines come along that you kind of realise just that what a brilliant band they were. And actually, it's a song from a long time previously. So that's great. But, there isn't a huge amount to get me excited in that top 10, if I'm honest.
instead of listening to music in advance of the semi-final, maybe you would enjoy the TV schedule then, Chris. So that day, well, the match itself in the evening was on both BBC One and ITV. So each of you are going to have to tell me which one would be your choice. But during the day, you could have been watching plenty of Wimbledon, which was going on throughout all of this. And, well, the schedule that I have here will show that the programmes that probably got binned when it all went to extra time and penalties would be Frontiers on BBC One. Big Brother's Bargain, it says here. Goodness me. That was listed as one of the Today's Choice options in, I don't know what newspaper you got this from, Stephen, but they've listed 2 items as the Today's Choice. Frontiers Big Brother Bargain, which I'm guessing never even came on because the game went on to extra time and penalties. And the other was Channel 4's Europe Express, which was on during the semi-final as well. And yet they make no mention whatsoever of the World Cup games in Today's Choices. Goodness me, what is going on here? If you did want to avoid the football, you instead of Europe Express on Channel 4, which I should say is a welcome return for an innovative current affairs programme. Wow, what a pick that was. Candle on the Hill on BBC 2, followed by an episode of MASH and Mother Love. Wow. ITV in advance of it, you could have been watching Home and Away after an episode of Blockbusters. Well, goodness me, that's excellent. Coronation Street probably didn't happen, neither did After Henry on ITV, while Channel 4 was that Europe Express, followed by Poetry in Motion, if you wanted to avoid the game entirely. So, Chris, if you didn't want the music, there's plenty for you to get your teeth into there. Were you a BBC man or an ITV man for this final, though?
Yeah, I'm going straight for Brookside. You've not mentioned Brookside on Channel 4 at 8 o'clock.
Sorry, yes, that's before Europe Express. So, yeah, you could have had both.
Well, what's going on there, you see, Sue, who is married to Terry, Terry's had a test. They can't conceive. Terry's had the test and found out that he can't have children. Trouble is that Sue's already got a child and Terry is daddy.
You know too much about this, Chris, because this is going way beyond what it says here in the listing. So this is proper knowledge.
I've got very good memories of this Brookside episode and this Brookside period.
You didn't watch this match at all, did you?
No, I watched the Omnibus. I watched the Omnibus on Saturday, probably before the third place playoff. But yeah, it's all kicking off in Brookside. Barry Grant is stirring it up, trying to wind Terry up into saying, well, who could be Daniel's father? Sue's distraught. It's all kicking off at number 9 or whatever house it was. It's not going to end well.
Yeah. Well, Barry and Terry were best mates, but Barry didn't like Sue at all, and he just had a problem with her for some reason. And that's what I remember. That's why he was stirring it up, because it might have been that Sue had taken his best mate away or something like that. Barry was always a bit funny like that, a bit possessive.
I'm forming the distinct impression I'm the only one who watched this match. You were all far too busy with someone else.
Omnibus. And video recorders, don't forget that.
Chris, did you watch it on BBC or ITV?
I would have watched it on BBC for the simple reason that there were no adverts. As basic as that explanation is, it's for the simple reason. Des Lynam, it feels safe, it feels comfortable, and we're not going to adverts every few minutes.
And Nessun Dorma, of course. Also on this day was Tour de France as well, so that would have given me a nice sporting build-up to this action as well. Stephen, what were you watching in the afternoon? Were you watching Fraggle Rock on BBC before we got to the action?
I've got a bit of time for Fraggle Rock. That had its moments. But yeah, lots of tennis on the go. I'd have been watching wall-to-wall tennis, I'm sure. But if the rains are starting at Wimbledon without the roof at the time, then yeah, definitely a bit of Fraggle Rock involved there. I would have had time for Neighbours as well, but given that I'd quit, I'd departed hydraulic retail, I would I would be watching the afternoon episode of it. The synopsis being Jim goes to the police who devise a plan to catch Helen's blackmailer. Henry sets up another crackpot scheme to make Bronwyn jealous, and the relationship between Scott and Poppy reaches a dangerous point.
Again, this is not mentioned in this screenshot, so you are going above and beyond here. The knowledge here. Oh, sorry, that's on the earlier episode.
That's it. But that's it. You've got to watch.
I was looking at the repeat at half.
You've got to watch it at half 1, not half 5.
This was a school day, Steve.
But if you're not watching,
not all of us have quit our jobs. Some of us had places to be.
But that's it. Even if you're in school, you should be sloping off to watch the half-one episode of Neighbours.
So this is the real reason Stephen quit his job. He needed to see the early episode of Neighbours. It's all coming out now. Joe. Oh, sorry, Stephen. BBC or ITV?
Oh, BBC.
Good.
Shadow of a doubt.
Joe, then, how about you?
BBC, definitely. Absolutely, definitely. Because ITV seemed to trivialise everything somehow. I know you've talked to Alton Wellesby before, and that's fine. I've read his book, which is good fun. But, the BBC just seemed to have more authority, and it seemed to be more an event with the BBC and more sort of official somehow. That's all. And the adverts. No adverts on the BBC.
Absolutely. I think the vast majority of the country were in agreement, as is usually the case on such occasions. And I don't know whether this was before or after the ITV World Cup curse that came in for several years, that England tended to lose the big clashes that they took. But there we go. They'd lost this occasion. We can blame ITV for that. Why not? Anyway, that has been quite the epic module going into England 1990 and all things around it. We have been on far longer than an extra time and penalties game, which was impressive achievement. So thank you very much, all of you, all three of you, for your contributions throughout. And thank you very much to everyone listening. I hope you've managed to stay with us for the duration and enjoyed everything that we've chatted through here. I hope it's brought back lots of good memories. Do give us a follow, give it a share, give it a like, all of those things. Spread the word. The more, the merrier when it comes to our listeners. And do join us again on the next podcast from Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. For now, though, it's arrivederci, it's one-on-one and all of that. We will speak to you again next time. Thank you and bye.